The Galactic Council chamber was built to intimidate, a cathedral of light and steel that stretched far into the void of space. Yet that day its walls seemed to hold their breath as the transport doors opened and she walked in. The alien girl with eyes like starlight, and behind her, chained in shimmering restraints, came the creature no one dared approach, a towering beast of shadow and muscle, with a jaw that could split a shuttle in half and eyes that burned like dying suns. Soldiers gripped their rifles tighter, ambassadors pulled their cloaks away as if distance would save them, and 100 alien species whispered the same name. Not hers, but the monster's, the one they called the Gravehound. A creature said to devour entire strike teams without slowing. Yet there she was, standing close to it, calm as starlight, the girl whose beauty and terror were bound in the same breath, and as the chamber trembled with fear, a human leaned forward from the far gallery, watching her, not with fear, but with something else entirely, something quiet and dangerous: curiosity. He had no rank, no banners on his chest, no armored guards at his back. He wasn't a general or a council envoy, just a field engineer named Ethan who happened to be on the observation deck during her arrival. And while the other species whispered warnings about her pet, Ethan simply watched the way she moved, the way her hand brushed against the creature's muzzle like it was nothing more than a loyal dog, and something about that quiet confidence pulled at him like gravity. It was a look that said she was alone, surrounded by enemies, and she didn't care, because nothing could touch her as long as the beast lived. The council guard screamed when the Gravehound roared, the sound shaking the glass domes, and in an instant rifles pointed at its head. But the girl simply raised one delicate hand, and the monster obeyed like a child hushed by its mother, lowering its head to the floor, silent again. That moment burned through every hollow screen across the galaxy, an image of terror and awe wrapped into one. And in the middle of it all, the only species that did not flinch was humanity. Ethan didn't know then that she came from a dying world, a place outside the Council's control, a place where predators were bred to protect the last of her kind, and she was their last princess, their last shield, standing in the court of those who hated her people. He just saw someone who didn't belong, someone who stood alone in a room full of fear. The council began their speeches, accusing her people of war crimes, of refusing to bow, of unleashing their beasts on border colonies, and every word they spat was built to make her feel small. But she didn't look down, didn't beg, didn't break. She simply stroked the muzzle of the Gravehound and waited. That was when Ethan's quiet fascination turned into something heavier, something that made him break every unspoken rule. He left the human observation line and walked down toward the lower gallery where no human was supposed to be, and with every step, the alien delegates turned their heads in disbelief. The Gravehound sensed movement before anyone else, its head snapping toward Ethan, its eyes narrowing, a growl low and deep rumbling through the floor like thunder. Soldiers screamed at him to stop, counselors barked for him to be restrained. But Ethan didn't pause, not even when the sound of his own heart roared in his ears. He kept walking until he stood only a few meters from the girl and her monster. She tilted her head slightly, curious rather than alarmed, and for the first time, someone stood close enough to see that the Gravehound's collar wasn't just a restraint. It was bleeding her too, tiny shimmering wires connecting her nervous system to the beast's mind. She was its anchor, its only chain. Everyone believed approaching the creature was suicide, but Ethan just knelt down, slowly, palms open, eyes steady, and whispered, "Hey there, big guy," like he was greeting a stray dog. The moment stretched like a blade over the chamber. The Gravehound bared its teeth. Alien gas filled the air as security bots aimed stun cannons. But then something impossible happened. The creature tilted its massive head and sniffed Ethan's hand. Low, cautious, then rumbled again, but not in warning, in recognition. Gasps rippled through the chamber as the princess's lips parted in a soft, shocked breath. No one had ever gotten close without being torn apart. Ethan's calm wasn't bravery. It was instinct, the kind humanity carried from 1,000 years of taming the impossible. She spoke then for the first time, her voice smooth like wind over glass, asking in her own tongue why he wasn't afraid, and he answered simply, "Because fear isn't the same as respect." That was the moment something shifted between them, a bond forged in silence while the galaxy watched in disbelief. Over the next cycles, rumors swept through the council like wildfire. The human and the alien princess, walking the lower decks together, the grave hound at their side like a living shadow, never attacking, always watching. The alien ambassadors called it a trick, a trap, some genetic manipulation, but soldiers whispered a different story. That the beast had accepted him, and by doing so, the girl had too. War drums beat louder beyond the stars, border colonies were falling, and the council wanted to turn the grave hound into a weapon, to rip it from her and bind it to their fleets. But Ethan saw the truth in her eyes, the same hollow rage that lived in the eyes of every cornered species before their extinction. He knew what they would do to her world, and he couldn't watch it happen. When the council voted to seize her, chaos erupted. Troops stormed the detention deck where she and the beast were held, and alarms screamed through the station. She didn't cry. She stood between them and her companion, knowing she would die first. But Ethan arrived before the blast doors closed. Without rank or permission, he hacked the security systems, dropping the gravity on the deck, and for a heartbeat, everything floated. The grave hound exploded into motion, not as a monster, but as a guardian, tearing through metal like paper, shielding her from the storm. Ethan dragged her through smoke and sirens, their hands clasped tight, the beast clearing a path through steel corridors. Every alien soldier who had once mocked humanity watched in stunned silence as a single human defied the most powerful council in the galaxy. Not for conquest, not for revenge, but for love. Their escape became a legend. Fighter squadrons chased their shuttle through the black sea of stars, but the Gravehound tore through interceptors mid-flight like a god of old myths. Humanity, silent for so long, finally made its move. Not with fleets, but with a message, a simple broadcast across the stars. If you come for them, you come for us. The Galactic Council trembled, realizing they had provoked the one species they thought too quiet, too small, too human. Planets that had feared the princess's beast now feared the wrath behind her protector. In the chaos that followed, alliances shifted, old enemies stepped back, and the girl who had once walked alone now walked beside the one who saw her, not as a monster, not as a threat, but as someone worth everything. Years later, legends would speak of the princess with the terrifying pet and the human who stole her heart, of a love that turned fear into loyalty, and of a monster who never again growled at a human hand. The Galactic Council would remember the day a simple engineer walked through their fear like it was smoke and changed everything. And if you ever walked the decks of the human flagship that followed, you'd still hear the distant echo of the Gravehound's roar, not as a warning, but as a promise. If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more epic tales of humanity among the stars, and don't forget to share this with someone who loves a good alien story in space. She couldn't forget the moment that strange human walked toward her and her beast-like fear didn't exist, because no one had ever done that before. Not in any council chamber, not on any battlefield, not since the day the Gravehound first drew blood under alien stars. Long after the council session ended and the halls emptied, his steady gaze stayed with her like an echo, pulling her mind away from the cold silence of her holding chamber, away from the weight of chains that bound her to this station. The metallic walls hummed softly as security drones hovered outside the door, their sensors scanning her every breath. The Gravehound lay beside her like a living shadow, its chest rising and falling slowly, but its golden eyes were wide awake, always watching, always waiting for her signal. To everyone else, it was a monster born from nightmares, a predator forged in the wild storms of a dying world. But to her, it was family, the last connection she had left. They had grown up together on a broken moon where the sky never cleared and children were taught to fight before they learned to speak. When their cities fell and her people scattered, the creature followed her through fire and ash. It had ripped through entire platoons to keep her alive, and now it was trapped here with her, caged like an animal, its fury simmering under its skin. She closed her eyes and tried to push away the memory of the council's words, the way they spat her name like poison, the way they stared not at her but at the beast, as if she were just the leash holding it back. In their eyes, she wasn't a princess. She was a problem to be solved, a danger to be controlled, a living reminder of a world they wanted to erase. And yet, in the middle of their fear, A single human had stood there with no weapons, no armor, just calm eyes and a heartbeat steady enough to reach even the gravehound. She didn't understand why the creature didn't tear him apart, why it had lowered its head like it recognized something in him, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Humans were strange to her kind, unpredictable, quiet in the ways that made predators pause. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the oldest, but they had a way of staring at monsters without blinking. That unsettled her more than the Council's threats. On the other side of the station, Ethan couldn't sleep either. He was back in his small maintenance quarters, the hum of machinery loud enough to drown out everything except his thoughts. He had replayed that moment 100 times already. The sound of the gravehound's growl, the shimmering heat in the air, the way his hand didn't shake when it sniffed him. His rational mind told him it was insane, that he should have stayed behind the security lines like everyone else, but something deeper inside him, something older than logic, had whispered step forward. He had grown up on the edges of human space, where the wild things still roamed, where his father had taught him to stand still when a predator stared you down, because stillness was power. Maybe the gravehound had seen that in him, or maybe it had simply chosen not to kill him. He wasn't sure which was worse. What he didn't know was that his quiet act of defiance hadn't gone unnoticed. Surveillance drones had captured every angle of that moment, and by now every military intelligence division, every council delegate, and every media outlet in the galaxy had the footage. Some called him insane, others called him reckless, but a few, the ones who understood what fear really was, called him dangerous. He had done something none of them could. The council had spent decades trying to break the creature with sedatives, weapons, shock fields, but the beast had never obeyed anyone except her. Now it had lowered its head to a human. That was enough to terrify them more than the monster itself. In the council towers above the stars, new orders were already being drafted: control the human or eliminate him. She sat in her dim cell with the lights flickering like a dying sun and whispered a single word in her language, a soft command that only the gravehound could understand. Its head lifted instantly, golden eyes locking on hers, and it let out a low rumble, not of anger but of anticipation. Could sense the storm gathering. The council soldiers didn't understand. They saw the beast as a weapon, but it was something far worse than that. It was loyal, and loyalty made monsters unpredictable. She reached out and pressed her palm to its muzzle, feeling the slow thrum of its heartbeat, and for the first time in years, she felt something strange in her chest. Not rage, not fear, but the faint spark of curiosity. Why did the human come closer? Why didn't he tremble? What was it about him that made the beast see him not as prey but as something else? Meanwhile, Ethan walked the silent hallways of the engineering sector, his badge giving him access to places most never saw. He wasn't supposed to be involved. He wasn't a soldier or a diplomat. He was just the guy who kept the air scrubbers working and the engines running. But now, everywhere he went, whispers followed him. Some saluted him like a hero. Others looked at him like a threat. And deep down, he felt it too. The pull of something bigger than him, something dangerous. He stopped at a maintenance hatch overlooking the detention decks below, watching her cell through layers of glass and steel. She sat there like a storm contained in human shape. The monster curled beside her like a coiled blade, and something inside him whispered again. She doesn't belong in a cage. Far above, the council's security division was already making plans. They would sedate the gravehound, dissect it, weaponize it, and they would move her to a black site far away from any public eye. But what none of them understood was that Ethan had seen something in her eyes that the council never noticed. An unbroken will not of a monster, but of a survivor. And somewhere between the weight of their fear and the silence of her defiance, Ethan made a quiet, dangerous decision. If they tried to hurt her, he wouldn't stand behind the glass again. He would stand beside her. As the station rotated slowly over the frozen rings of a distant star, the night shift lights dimmed and silence swept through the decks. Drones clicked into standby, guards sipped their bitter coffee, and everyone thought the danger was sleeping. But two pairs of eyes remained wide awake. One human, one alien princess, and between them, a creature that could bring empires to their knees. None of them knew it yet, but this was the night everything would begin to burn. The alarms began with a whisper, a soft pulse through the ventilation system that most people ignored, but Ethan had spent years on the station and he knew the difference between drills and the real thing. This wasn't a scheduled test. It was movement, authorized, silent, dangerous. Somewhere deep in the detention sector, hidden systems were powering up, the kind that only came online when someone was being moved or erased. He pushed through the narrow engineering corridors, the glow of red warning lights spreading like blood along the walls. His stomach tightened as the thought hit him. They were moving her. The council didn't make big announcements for things like this. They did it quietly, behind closed doors, where no one could protest, and by the time anyone found out, it was already over. Down below, in the containment cell, she felt it too. The gravehound stirred first, its ears flattening as it lifted its massive head and sniffed the air, its breath misting in the cold. Its growl was low, rumbling through the floor like distant thunder. She sat up slowly, her hands brushing against the creature's scarred muzzle, her eyes narrowing at the subtle shift in the lights. She had been held by the council long enough to recognize this rhythm. It was the sound of relocation. They weren't going to keep her here anymore. They were going to disappear her into some hidden facility, strip her beast apart, and turn its bones into weapons. She pressed her forehead against the creature's, whispering something soft in her tongue. A promise she had made the night they escaped their dying world. No one would take it from her again. Ethan's boots echoed through the empty service halls as he bypassed one locked hatch after another. He shouldn't have been able to move this freely, but his years of fixing what no one else wanted to fix gave him access codes buried in forgotten systems. He ducked beneath a flickering maintenance light, his heart pounding harder with each step. He didn't have a plan, only a storm of instinct and the memory of the way she had looked at him, like someone who'd been alone for too long. He reached the observation deck that overlooked the transfer corridor. Through the reinforced glass, he saw them. 4 armored soldiers in black exosuits, their movements too sharp, too careful. Behind them, floating on a grav sled, was a containment rig designed for apex predators. They were here for the gravehound. The creature sensed them long before they arrived. It rose to its full height, chains clanking as its muscles rippled under its dark hide. The guards outside tensed, their rifles aimed but their hands shaking slightly. Everyone feared the gravehound, even when it was chained, even when it was sedated. She stood slowly beside it, her chin lifted, her eyes cold as starlight. She didn't beg, didn't speak. She just looked at the soldiers like they were already dead. One of the guards spoke into his comm, his voice shaking despite the mask. "We have authorization. Commence transfer." The steel door hissed open. Ethan didn't think. He moved. Years of fixing broken reactors and failing pressure seals had trained his hands to act faster than his thoughts. He popped open a side panel, yanked a set of emergency override wires, and crossed them with a maintenance spike. For a second, nothing happened. Then the corridor lights snapped to black. Sirens screamed. The grav sled tilted and crashed. The transfer corridor plunged into emergency lockdown. The guards shouted as blast doors slammed shut around them, sealing the corridor like a tomb. And then the gravehound roared. It was a sound that didn't belong in steel corridors. It was older than the council, older than the walls that tried to contain it. The blast of air shattered the helmet's audio sensors, making the soldiers stagger back. Chains snapped like twigs as the creature lunged forward, dragging steel bolts out of the floor. One guard raised his weapon, but she moved faster, slamming her hand onto the control shackle around the creature's neck. The collar split in half with a sharp, glowing crack. For the first time since its capture, the gravehound was free. Ethan burst through the auxiliary hatch and dropped into the corridor below, landing hard on his shoulder, rolling against the cold floor. A soldier turned his rifle on him, but before he could fire, a massive shadow blurred past. The gravehound moved like lightning, slamming into the soldier and sending him flying against the wall like a rag doll. The air filled with the smell of scorched metal and hot blood. Ethan stared for a heartbeat at the impossible sight. The beast wasn't tearing him apart, it was shielding him. It stood between him and the remaining soldiers, its golden eyes narrowed, its breath a steady storm. The princess locked eyes with Ethan through the chaos, and for the first time since they met, something like trust flickered there. "Why are you here?" she breathed in her language, but he understood the meaning without the words. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The alarms were blaring through the station now, security squads mobilizing on every deck, automated defense systems booting up. There was no turning back. He reached out his hand, not to the beast, but to her. Her eyes widened at the gesture, as if no one had ever offered her a choice before. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his, and the gravehound growled low, not in threat, but in warning to everything else. They moved fast through the service tunnels, shadows slicing through flashing red lights. Ethan led the way with the map of the station etched into his memory, while she followed with silent, predatory grace, the gravehound slinking behind them like a living storm. Drones buzzed through the upper corridors, soldiers shouted into comms, but the maintenance routes were old, built for people who actually understood the bones of the station. No one monitored them anymore. That was their only chance. When they reached the lower gravity core, the sound of distant engines shuddered through the metal like a heartbeat. The council's fleets were preparing to scramble. She stopped suddenly at a narrow hatch. Her hand tightened on his. For a heartbeat, she just stared at him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. She had grown up in a world where trust meant death, where every smile was a lie, every hand a weapon. But this human hadn't asked for anything. He had walked into danger without a shield. She didn't understand why, but she knew what it meant. It meant freedom wasn't hers alone anymore. It was theirs. The gravehound's tail slammed against the wall, a warning. Troops were closing in. Ethan forced the hatch open, cold air spilling in from the shuttle bay tunnels below. Beyond that hatch was either escape or a quick death. But neither of them hesitated, because for the first time since the war burned her world, she wasn't running alone. The alarms roared like war drums as the three of them vanished into the dark. The shuttle bay was a storm of flashing lights and metal screams, the kind of chaos that only happened when the council lost control, and this time they had. Ships groaned in their moorings as lockdown shutters sealed the main hangar. Alarms shrieked through the air, and the smell of burning ozone stung every breath. Ethan crouched low as a squad of armed drones zipped past overhead, their red optics scanning for movement. He and the princess moved like shadows through the maintenance platforms above the main bay, the gravehound gliding behind them like a nightmare on silent pause. Down below, soldiers scrambled to set up barricades, shouting orders that were already too late. The council had always feared this day, the day the beast would break its chains, but none of them expected that a single human would be the spark that lit the fuse. Ethan led her through a narrow service bridge suspended high above the launch decks. His hands gripped the cold railings as wind from the pressurized vents whipped against their faces. Below, armored squads formed a tight perimeter around the launch bay entrance, their weapons gleaming like jagged teeth under emergency lights. The princess moved beside him with the effortless precision of someone who had been hunted all her life, her body silent but alert, her eyes scanning every corner. Behind them, the gravehound paused at the center of the bridge and lowered its massive head, its nostrils flaring as it scented the soldiers below. Its golden eyes narrowed, the faintest rumble building in its chest like the opening growl of a storm. "They've already sealed the outer doors," Ethan whispered, voice low, steady. "They'll keep every ship here until they have you in chains again." Her gaze didn't flinch. She had seen cages before. She had seen worse. "Then we take a ship," she said softly, her accent sharp but clear. Ethan almost laughed at how simple she made it sound. But something in her voice made him believe it wasn't impossible. Not for her. Not with that creature at her side. He pointed toward an auxiliary cargo hauler docked in the far corner of the bay, smaller than a gunship but fast enough to break orbit. "That one," he whispered. "No heavy weapons, no transponder. We can ghost it out if we time the launch between system resets." The problem was getting to it alive. As if reading his thoughts, the gravehound stepped forward, its claws scraping against the bridge with a slow, dragging sound that sent a ripple of unease through the soldiers below. One of them looked up, saw the shadow above, and froze. His rifle trembled in his hands. Ethan saw it too late. The alarm howl changed pitch, sharp and urgent, as the first squad fired a flare round that burst into brilliant white light. The beast didn't wait for orders. It roared, a sound that shook the steel supports and drowned out every other noise in the hangar. Soldiers screamed. Some fired blindly upward, their bolts sparking against the bridge. Others turned and ran, because no amount of training could stop what instinct screamed. You don't fight something like that. The princess didn't even flinch. She jumped over the railing as the beast leapt beside her, both of them dropping into the chaos like blades cutting through silk. Ethan followed a heartbeat later, hitting the cargo platform hard, rolling into cover behind a container as pulse fire scorched the air where his head had been. The Gravehound landed like a meteor, the deck groaning beneath its weight. In a single sweep of its claws, it tore through the first squad, sending bodies flying, their rifles scattering like brittle bones. Soldiers tried to regroup, but the creature moved too fast, too brutal. It didn't fight like an animal. It fought like something that had spent its whole life protecting one person. The princess moved through the chaos with the same savage grace, sliding under a blast, driving a blade into a soldier's wrist, ripping the weapon free and firing back in one smooth motion. Ethan stared for a split second at the way she moved. Not like a captive, not like a victim, but like someone who had been waiting for this moment all along. He snapped out of it when a bolt of plasma sliced past his ear. Ethan ducked behind a crate, slammed his hand into a manual override panel, and began rerouting the cargo ship's power systems remotely. He had spent half his life crawling through the guts of stations like this. They thought they were locking him out, but they'd built their systems on the bones of his work. "Give me 60 seconds, he shouted. The princess didn't look back. She raised her stolen rifle and fired into the upper deck, covering him. The Gravehound tore through a barricade with a snarl that echoed like thunder. Alarms screamed as fuel lines ruptured, sending showers of sparks into the air. The hangar lights flickered once, twice, then dimmed to emergency power. The moment had come. Ethan slammed the final command through the panel. The hauler roared to life, its engines coughing out waves of blue fire. The soldiers realized too late what was happening. Reinforcements flooded in through the blast doors, armored in heavier suits, their boots pounding like war drums. A dozen rifles aimed at them, and for a heartbeat the world held its breath. The princess stepped in front of Ethan, her back straight, the Gravehound towering over her shoulder, golden eyes glowing like twin suns. This was the moment where most people would beg or run. She simply stared them down. Then the beast charged. It moved like a storm unleashed, smashing into the first line of soldiers with bone-shattering force. Rifles snapped, armor crumpled like tin. Ethan and the princess ran through the chaos toward the hauler, ducking under the beast's sweeping limbs. She vaulted onto the ship's loading ramp in a single, fluid motion, turning to cover Ethan as he scrambled up behind her. The Gravehound slammed its massive claws into the ramp and climbed aboard like a creature born for war. "Close it!" Ethan shouted. She slammed her hand onto the inner hatch controls. The ramp rose, sealing them inside as plasma bolts slammed into the outer hull. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. "They're locking the clamps," Ethan muttered, fingers flying over the controls. "They won't hold us," she said. And for the first time, Ethan saw her smile. Not soft, but sharp, like the edge of a blade. He overrode the docking clamps, engines screaming in protest. The bay floor vibrated as the ship strained against its restraints. A final, shuddering groan ripped through the metal as the clamps snapped. The hauler surged forward, smashing through the security barrier in a blast of light and steel. Soldiers dived for cover as the ship roared out into the black. Ethan pulled the controls up hard, the hauler skimming past defense turrets that lit the void with streaks of fire. The Gravehound crouched in the cargo hold, its muscles coiled, as if ready to leap at the stars themselves. The princess leaned against the cockpit doorway, her hair wild from the escape, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on the stars opening around them. For a moment the chaos faded. The hangar was behind them, the void ahead. She looked at Ethan, her voice quiet but certain. "You've just started a war." Ethan didn't look away from the controls. "Then let's make sure we win it." The ship vanished into the darkness, leaving the council station burning in their wake, the echo of the Gravehound's roar still shattering the quiet of the stars. The stars around the fleeing hauler blurred into streaks of pale light as the ship tore through the orbital perimeter at speeds it was never designed to handle. Ethan's hands gripped the flight controls hard enough to turn his knuckles white, sweat stinging his eyes as warning lights blinked like angry red stars across the console. The hull rattled with every burst of acceleration, the engines howling against the vacuum like a wounded animal, but the ship held. Behind him, the princess stood silent and still, her gaze locked on the black expanse outside as if the entire galaxy was waiting to swallow them. The Gravehound crouched low in the cargo bay, its golden eyes burning like molten metal, its tail twitching slowly. It didn't seem afraid. It never was. But Ethan knew what was coming. This was just the beginning. The council would never let something like this go. Far behind them, the station wasn't quiet. It was on fire. Squadrons of sleek black interceptors were already launching from the hangars, their engines like burning stars as they fanned out into formation. These weren't the slow patrol drones, they were council hunters, built to chase down anything that tried to run. And now their target wasn't just a fugitive princess or her beast. It was a human who had just declared war without saying a single word. She moved closer to the cockpit, her footsteps almost silent despite the metal floor beneath them. Ethan could feel her presence behind him, calm but sharp, like a blade waiting to be drawn. "They're coming," she said softly, her accent carving through the hum of the engines. "I know," Ethan answered, his voice tight but steady. He flipped a row of switches, rerouting auxiliary power to the maneuvering thrusters. "This ship's not made for fighting, but it'll fly dirty. They'll expect clean burns and predictable turns. They're not getting that." She tilted her head slightly, studying the human who had just thrown away his life without hesitation. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't look at her, eyes fixed on the stars ahead. "Because they were going to take everything from you. And I've watched them do that too many times to others." His jaw tightened. "Not this time." There was a long silence, the kind that stretched like a thread between two people who didn't need to speak to understand. The Gravehound let out a low rumble, as if it approved. The proximity sensors shrieked to life. A swarm of interceptors broke through the dark, their sleek wings catching the starlight like blades. The council didn't negotiate. They hunted. And now they were closing in fast, their attack pattern already locking on to the small hauler. Ethan gritted his teeth and yanked the control yoke hard, spinning the ship into a violent corkscrew. Plasma bolts screamed past the hull, streaks of green light flashing across the black. The princess stumbled slightly but caught herself on the frame, her eyes narrowing at the swarm behind them. She wasn't afraid. If anything, she looked like someone waking from a long sleep. "They'll destroy us," she said calmly, not as a question but as fact. Ethan gave a thin smile. "Only if they can catch us." He dove the ship into the dense orbit ring surrounding a dead moon, a graveyard of shattered satellites and forgotten war debris, a place no one sane flew through. The interceptors followed, but they weren't built for chaos. They were built for precision. And Ethan had grown up flying scavenger runs through fields just like this. He cut the lights, killed the transponder, and let the hauler drift, weaving between wrecked hulls and broken steel like a ghost. The ship scraped against a fragment of armor plating, sparks trailing behind them. The Gravehound paced slowly through the cargo hold, its claws clinking softly against the deck. Its golden eyes tracked every shudder, every vibration. It didn't need sensors to know they were being hunted. The princess lowered herself beside Ethan, resting one hand on the console, her other hand lightly touching the scarred metal of the bulkhead. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice quiet. "They see monsters. You saw me." Ethan didn't answer right away. The silence between them was heavy with everything neither of them knew how to say. Finally, he murmured, "Maybe because I know what it's like to be the one they're afraid of." Her head turned slightly, her eyes studying him in a way that made his chest tighten. For so long, She had seen only fear in the faces of others. Now, for the first time, she saw something else. Someone who didn't see a beast or a princess or a weapon. Just her. The sensors pinged again. One of the interceptors had broken formation, sweeping low through the debris field. Its targeting array cut through the shadows like a blade of red light. "They found us," Ethan muttered. He slammed the thrusters to full, the hauler kicking forward with a bone-rattling lurch. Plasma fire exploded behind them, the shockwave rattling the ship. The Gravehound snarled, its muscles coiling like a spring. Ethan dove deeper into the debris, engines screaming, ducking through the skeletal remains of warships long forgotten. But the Council ships were faster, circling like wolves. One locked on. The first missile streaked through the wreckage, closing the distance like a falling star. Alarms blared. She didn't hesitate. Moving faster than he thought possible, she ran toward the lower cargo bay. The Gravehound followed her like a living storm. She reached the exterior access hatch and slammed her hand against the control panel. The blast doors slid open, revealing the cold void of space through the shimmering force field. The missile's light glimmered closer. The Gravehound stepped forward, massive muscles flexing as she whispered a single command. The creature leapt. Ethan barely caught the blur of its movement on the external cam feed. A black shape streaking out into the void, its claws slamming into the missile mid-flight, tearing it apart in a blinding flash of fire and metal. For a heartbeat, the stars disappeared in the explosion. Then the beast came back through the force field like a phantom, smoke trailing from its armor-like hide, landing in the bay with a bone-shaking thud. The princess turned, her breathing steady, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan just stared at her through the cockpit glass. "You sent it after a missile." She stepped closer, her voice calm, almost cold. "It's not a pet," she said. "It's a protector." The interceptor squadron scattered briefly after the explosion, giving Ethan just enough time. He slammed the throttle forward, bursting out of the debris field and into open space. The stars opened before them like a vast ocean, and for the first time the hauler wasn't just running. It was free. But freedom came with a price. The Council would not forget this. A single human, a fugitive princess, and the most feared creature in the galaxy had just humiliated their most secure installation. It wasn't just a breakout. It was a declaration. They would hunt them to the ends of space. And deep inside, Ethan knew he wouldn't stop running this time. This wasn't about a mission anymore. This was about something bigger than himself, something worth every risk. The princess stood at the viewport, the starlight washing across her face. She didn't smile, but for the first time since they met, her shoulders weren't weighed down by chains. The Gravehound lay at her feet like a sleeping storm, its breathing slow and steady. Ethan glanced at them from the pilot's chair, the faint ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "You know," he said quietly, "they'll come for us with everything they have." She met his gaze, her voice like iron wrapped in silk. "Then let them come." Outside, the void was endless, and for the first time in both their lives, they weren't running from it, they were claiming it. The hunt had begun. The black void stretched endlessly before them, the kind of silence that made men either break or find their strength, and Ethan could feel it in his bones now, that quiet before the storm, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing against the thin walls of the hauler like a second atmosphere. The hum of the ship's engines was steady but rough, a reminder that the vessel was never built for this kind of run. But the silence inside was even louder. The princess stood at the main viewport, arms folded across her chest, her sharp eyes tracing the starlight as if she could already see the enemy closing in. The Gravehound lay coiled in the cargo bay like a shadow carved out of war itself, its golden eyes half-lidded, but every breath it took shook the floor. This was the first time in years she wasn't behind a cage, and yet freedom didn't feel like safety. Freedom felt like the start of a war. Ethan sat slouched in the pilot's seat, his fingers tapping absently on the console, but his mind was a battlefield. He had been a station engineer his entire life. His biggest fights were against leaking coolant lines and failing grav systems, not the entire Galactic Council. Yet here he was, A single human sitting at the controls of a stolen hauler with a fugitive princess and a living nightmare in his cargo bay. The thought should have crushed him, but instead it lit something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. A dangerous, quiet fire. For too long, humanity had sat on the sidelines, keeping their heads low while the council decided what was allowed and what wasn't. For too long, Ethan had watched stronger voices dictate who mattered and who didn't. This time, he wasn't stepping aside. The console blinked softly. Long-range scans showed multiple heat signatures on pursuit vectors, their speed climbing fast. The council interceptors weren't giving up. They were regrouping, and soon, they'd bring the kind of fleet that made stars tremble. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he expanded the scan. "We've got incoming," he said quietly. His voice didn't rise, didn't shake, but the weight of those words filled the small cockpit like smoke. She turned slowly, her silver eyes glinting under the dim emergency lights. "How long?" "Not long enough," he muttered. 2, maybe 3 hours if we keep running straight. Less if they bring a jump relay." She walked closer, the sound of her boots soft against the floor, her movements fluid, deliberate, like someone who had spent her whole life making decisions on the edge of death. "Then we don't keep running straight," she said calmly. Ethan smirked, a tired, crooked smile. "You have a plan?" She tilted her head slightly, the faintest spark of something fierce flashing in her eyes. "No one survives running forever. You don't win against the council by begging for mercy. You win by making them bleed." Her voice carried no fear, only the steady certainty of someone who had already lost everything once. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her. Not as a princess, not as the girl with the terrifying beast, but as someone who was carved from the same kind of stubborn will that built Earth's survival centuries ago. He turned back to the controls, his jaw setting. "Then we make them bleed." She leaned over the navigation table, fingers gliding across the holographic map. "There's a storm belt near the Dead Star line. Radiation fields. Sensor interference. No one follows through there. It's suicide for clean ships." Ethan stared at the pulsing red line on the map, the place where most pilots never returned. "Perfect," he whispered. The Gravehound shifted in the cargo bay as if it sensed what they were planning. It stood to its full height, a wall of muscle and scar, its golden eyes fixed on the stars. It was born on a world where storms could rip the sky apart, where predators hunted predators. It wasn't afraid of anything. The princess stepped beside it, pressing her hand to its thick hide. "It knows," she murmured softly. "It can smell their blood already." Ethan pulled the hauler out of its lazy drift and angled it toward the storm belt. The starlight outside dimmed as a massive cloud of distorted radiation fields filled the viewport, swirling like black smoke mixed with lightning. Every sane captain in the galaxy avoided this place. It chewed through sensors, fried shields, and warped navigation. But humanity had grown up on worse. Ethan wasn't aiming to outgun the council. He was aiming to disappear. As they crossed the first edge of the storm belt, the ship groaned like it could feel the weight of the void pressing down on it. Static crackled through the comms. The stars outside blurred into streaks of blue and crimson as radiation danced like fireflies across the hull. The Gravehound lowered itself, its ears flattening, not out of fear but readiness. This was the kind of darkness it understood. The princess gripped the edge of the console, her jaw clenched, but she didn't flinch. She had grown up in storms like this too. Behind them, the pursuing fleet began to fracture. The first wave of interceptors tried to follow and vanished into static. Their sensors fried almost instantly. A second wave hesitated, their formation breaking like glass. Ethan allowed himself a quiet breath, but he knew it wasn't over. The council wasn't made of cowards. They'd send something bigger, something smarter, something built to kill monsters. The ship jerked violently, throwing him against the harness. A massive energy surge ripped through the hull, alarm screaming. A shadow moved in the storm behind them, bigger than a fighter, heavier than a cruiser. Ethan glanced at the rear scanners, and his blood ran cold. One of the council's Hunter-class ships had followed them in. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It was a predator built to track through storms like this, a warship with teeth. She stood behind him, calm as ever, but her fingers brushed the console like she was tracing the edge of a blade. "If we run, it will catch us," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew this wasn't a chase anymore. It was a hunt. He killed the forward lights, letting the hauler sink deeper into the storm, vanishing into the swirling dark. Radiation flickered around them, painting everything in violent pulses of color. The Gravehound moved to the airlock, its claws scraping against the floor, low growls rolling through the ship like distant thunder. She followed it, her step steady. Ethan watched her silhouette for a heartbeat. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She trusted him to fly. And for some reason he couldn't explain, he trusted her to survive. The Hunter-class ship emerged from the radiation behind them like a leviathan rising from a black sea, its lights piercing the dark, its cannons locking onto the hauler. A beam of searing energy sliced through the storm, grazing their port side. The hull screamed. Ethan jerked the controls, rolling them away, sparks showering the cockpit. The princess slammed her hand on the internal comm, opened the bay door. Ethan's eyes snapped to her. "You can't." But she was already walking toward the Gravehound. He exhaled once and flipped the switch. The cargo bay opened to the storm, the void screaming against the force field. The Gravehound leapt out like a god of war, disappearing into the radiation storm with terrifying speed. The Hunter ship's scanners flickered, alarms echoing faintly through their comms. Then, in the heart of the storm, a single golden light flared. The beast hit their ship like a living missile. Its claws ripped through the ventral shielding, its roar shattering the comm feeds. Explosions bloomed in the storm like dying suns as the Hunter-class warship began to tear apart from the inside, its hull splitting in a wave of fire and shadow. She stood at the edge of the bay, her eyes glowing in the flickering stormlight, whispering something in her language that Ethan didn't understand but felt deep in his chest. It was a promise. The Hunter ship tried to fight back. It fired wildly into the storm, but the Gravehound moved too fast, ripping through its heart like it had been waiting for this moment its whole life. The final explosion lit the storm belt like a second sun. Ethan pulled the hauler away from the fireball, the engines whining, the storm swallowing the light behind them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ship, the distant rumble of the storm, and their breaths. Then the Gravehound returned, streaked with smoke and fire, slamming into the bay like a victorious beast. She knelt beside it, pressing her forehead to its scarred muzzle, her lips whispering words too soft for Ethan to hear. When she finally looked up, there was something fierce and unshakable in her eyes. She walked back to the cockpit, silent, powerful, untouchable. Ethan met her gaze and nodded once. They both understood it now. The galaxy would come for them with fleets and fire, but it wouldn't matter, because fear had changed sides. The storm belt closed behind them like a curtain, and their ship vanished into the dark. What began as a desperate escape was no longer just flight. It was the beginning of a legend. A human who didn't flinch, a princess who didn't kneel, and a beast that made gods tremble. The Galactic Council had made a mistake, and the galaxy would remember it.